Well, I'm also proud to welcome Jane Sellen. She is with the Californians for. Let me have you introduce yourself because I'm busy pushing buttons. Hi, how are you doing tonight?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Thanks so much for having me on. Jane Sellen, I'm co-director of the statewide coalition Californians for Pesticide Reform.
Thank you for being here with us tonight. Now, you have been lobbying the state government to make some reforms on specific pesticides. We've been following this issue. We've had Mark Weldner on before, your director, and I'm wondering what the latest is because we live in the Monterey Bay area, in an area that is surrounded by agricultural fields. Many of them are sprayed and fumigated with a series of pesticides. And there are many schools that are rather near some of these fields. So we're always concerned about this issue. Could you take us up to date a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many pesticides that are used, so it's very frustrating to be working on them one by one, but that's kind of where we are with some of the really egregious ones, the most hazardous pesticides, the most drift-prone, the most problematic. And the prime example of that is the one that yesterday there was a public hearing in Sacramento to discuss a new regulation for a cancer-causing fumigant pesticide called 1,3-dichloropropene. And I'm guessing most of your listeners have never heard of this chemical, but it's actually the third most heavily used pesticide in California, more than 12 million pounds each year. And again, because it's a fumigant, so a gas, if you picture, when you see a house fumigated, they cover it in a tent, right? Because it's a gas that gets everywhere. So that's being used on our food crops, and people that live near it are severely exposed to a chemical that we know causes cancer.
Wow. So what are the typical crops that farmers are using these on?
Well, it's actually in the last year that we have data for, which is 2018, it was used on 44 different crops, so it's very widely used. But, it's used most heavily on strawberry crops along the Central Coast in the Monterey Bay area, and then on almonds and actually walnuts and grapes and some others in the San Joaquin Valley. It's a pre-plant fumigant, so it actually doesn't leave a residue on the food that you buy in the store. This is not really so much of a health concern for people that are just eating food that came from fumigated soils. It's a serious concern if you live near one of those treated fields, because then you are exposed. And actually, typically along the coast, these high-value strawberry crops, they get covered with what's called a TIF tarp, which is totally impermeable film, and it's supposed to keep the emissions kind of contained, a lot like tenting a house, actually. But when they're used in the San Joaquin Valley, they do not use tarps. It's the kind of crop like almonds, orchards, is really hard to tarp, and they just don't. So those gases just go everywhere, and the emissions are very, very high in the valley.
Yes, we have been reading about air quality being very low all throughout the San Joaquin Valley. And then locally here we have, as you know, a huge number of strawberry crops surrounding very inhabited areas. And even though, like you said, they're impermeable, they are getting somewhere, right? They go into the soil.
Exactly. And so the Department of Pesticide Regulation maintains, I think it's currently 6 air monitors around the state, including one in Ohlone Elementary School right there on the Monterey-Santa Cruz border. And every year since they've been monitoring, the total, the average concentration of 1,3-dichloropropene has exceeded the level that our state toxicologists say is safe for a lifetime cancer risk. So picture if you're living there day in, day out, for the course of your life, you're getting a steady dose, and it's a level that the scientists at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, we call it OEHHA, that they say is too high, and that's been the case every single year since they've been measuring, in 2012, since they've been measuring at Ohlone, and everywhere, and all 6 monitors in the states show the same picture.
And it looked like from your pictures of the turnout that many people did come and they protested and marched, and some of these were people who marched to the statue of Cesar Chavez to speak about this event.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary day yesterday in Sacramento. We have people, basically the state, because they're regulating they have a statutory obligation to hold one public hearing at least, and they did the bare minimum. They did one in Sacramento, and so that's miles from treated fields, but people came literally 16-hour round trip. We had 20 people coming from Oxnard, and they stayed in hotels the night before. Mind you, these are mostly Spanish-speaking, almost all farm workers, people least able to mobilize and take time off, but they showed up because it's super personal for them. So what we heard from the roughly 100 people that showed up was just story after heartbreaking story of suffering, cancer, illness, loss. It was people were in tears. It was quite a litany of please, state, do something to reduce use, because the regulation as is currently proposed, I mentioned that OEHHA has set a risk level. Well, DPR is not going with that risk level. The Department of Pesticide Regulation, they're going with the level that Dow, the manufacturer, has proposed. They've picked that one, and if your listeners would want a clue as to why that might be, I think people don't realize that the Department of Pesticide Regulation is actually funded by pesticide sales. And so total sales of pesticides have stayed really, really steady for 30 years now, because, the department would go broke if it actually did anything to reduce the use.
Well, that's a huge conflict of interest, and I would hope that someone would put some legislation out that would change that equation, because there's a huge incentive to maintain the amount of pesticides being put on fields. So is there any legislator that's willing to carry that one?
Well, actually, the department a couple of years ago did propose some reform of the way it was funded, and its proposal actually was to tier that fee so that the more hazardous pesticides cost more to use, because, they cost more to regulate, and the idea being to incentivize less hazardous pesticide use. That died. It didn't go anywhere. And now the state got actually funding in the last state budget to study the mill fee. And the mill fee is the name of the tax that is on pesticide sales at the first point of sale in California. It's currently 2.1 cents per dollar of sale. And that, as I said, funds the bulk of the department. About 80% of the department's funding comes from that tax. So, yeah, they're studying it. And what I'm not hearing in terms of the proposals is any effort to really uncouple that relationship between pesticide sales and department funding. And that's what needs to happen. It just needs to be disincentivized.
You have a quote here from Yaneli Martinez, a Greenfield City Council member in Monterey County, saying that, and now DPR has given us a number for how little they value farm worker communities. According to them, we're worth 14 times less than other California residents, because that's how much more cancer DPR is willing to allow by exposure to 1,3-D than our state toxicologists at OEHHA say is safe. This is a racist policy. How do you respond to that being said?
Well said, Councilwoman Martinez. Absolutely. That's, OEHHA has recommended a concentration of 0.04 parts per billion. DPR has gone with Dow's number, which is 0.56. And yes, that is literally 14 times higher than our state toxicologists believe is safe.
You wouldn't want the tobacco company telling you how much tobacco would be acceptable before it gave you cancer, would you now? Because they have an interest in selling cigarettes. And the same is true here, where you have Dow Chemicals, the company who said how much toxics we were allowed to put on our field. That's amazing. So
it is. Yeah. I don't know if you have any. Do we have just another minute? And
we have actually 5 more minutes. So yes, let's talk about it.
Well, that the nature of that collusion between Dow and the department is why, basically the way 1,3-D used to be regulated was that DPR allowed Dow, the manufacturer, to create some rules, set what was called a use cap, how much could be used per 6 by 6 square mile township in the state, and then Dow was in charge of monitoring it as well. So we sued and said that's an illegal regulation, and DPR needs to do a lawful regulation. And we won, and that's why DPR proposed this regulation. So, yeah, the collusion between the regulated entity and the regulator is a long and sorry story, unfortunately.
There's some phrase or word that describes that. Or was it regulatory drift? It's a very kind of benign word, but it means that the company that's being regulated has undue influence over the regulators to the point where the regulator starts identifying with the plight of the regulated and actually lets them write legislation or write rules. And that seems like what's happening here.
I think that that is a piece of it. But again, the financial incentive for a blockbuster chemical like this that's used in such large volume, I think that really influences DPR's decision making as well. As well as, sort of, like our last director at the Department of Pesticide Regulation, who just left last year, he went on to work for Syngenta, which is one of the pesticide giants. So cozy. Yeah.
Yeah, that it certainly seems like a revolving door. And if that person had the promise of a cushy job when he retired from the government, which doesn't pay as much as big chemical corporations, right. He would be being soft on them because he'd want a cushy offer when he left. And that ought to be illegal too. Just the sort of revolving door between industry and government. There should be at least 3 or 4 or 5 years before you're allowed to take a job in the very industry that you were regulating.
Absolutely. Very much, he has taken his governmental expertise and now industry is benefiting from it.
Yes. It seems like I'm reminded of the plot of some really bad movie I was watching on Netflix, but it's true. It's actually real life.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
And so tell us what your organization does to push back against these powerful, very well-funded interests that seem like they're impervious to public opinion. What do you do? What do we do so that we don't feel so helpless about these things poisoning us?
Yeah, so we're a 200-plus member coalition, and we formed deliberately back in 1996 in order to coordinate all the expertise that's necessary to make change when it comes to pesticide policy in California. So we brought together organizers and legal expertise and scientists and media, and it takes all of these. And really what we always say is that, what industry has going for it is enormous amount of money. What we have going for us is the power of the people, and that's literally what we bring. We combat industry, immense spending with just showing up. And as I said, those 100 people that showed up yesterday wouldn't necessarily know that a major decision is about to be made that's really going to affect their lives and affect their literally could potentially cause them cancer, unless we had organizers on the ground informing, mobilizing, building local leadership so that people feel empowered to show up. So as far as what your listeners can do, in the Monterey Bay area, we have a local coalition, Safe Ag, Safe Schools, and certainly, all are welcome to join. They meet every month in Salinas, Greenfield, and Watsonville. And you can find all kinds of information and contacts on our website, which is pesticidereform.org.
Fantastic. So Safe Ag, Safe Schools is all one word online if you're looking to join. Is that correct?
Yes. I'd have to check their website. It's either Safe Ag, Safe Schools or SAS. But a quick Google search will take you there.
Great. So listeners in Santa Cruz can go to Watsonville, Salinas, or Greenfield, I think you said, if they're interested in attending a monthly meeting. And what about people who are not meeting goers but just want to do something else? What could they do?
Yeah, well, get in touch with us through our website, and the email is pesticidereform.org, and we'd certainly add you to our newsletter list, and then you can be informed about alerts, opportunities to call the department, call your legislator, sign on to a petition. Again, it's just really important. Like, nobody's going to speak up about 1,3-dichloropropene, this chemical no one's ever heard of, unless they're informed and unless they have the opportunity to mobilize and organize, sign a petition, write. People really don't know what's being sprayed around them, which actually ties into another very active campaign that we're doing, which is to win really a first in the world almost system of advanced notification before certain hazardous pesticides are used. And 1,3-D would be one of those pesticides that people would be notified for. I think we're going to get it. It looks like we're going to get pesticide notification next year, and that's the result of years and years of organizing, mobilizing, pestering, showing up to hearings, and telling our story.
Well, thank you for telling the story of the people who couldn't be here tonight, but that went to Sacramento, took their time to speak up to the powers that be there about wanting not to be poisoned by these chemicals anymore. So thanks for the work you do, Jane, and I really appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here on Talk of the Bay. That was Jane, and she is with Californians for Pesticide Reform, and we're so glad she could join us here on Talk of the Bay. And you are the most important part of the equation. Thank you for listening tonight to Talk of the Bay. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and coming up at 6 o'clock, we'll be listening to a very cool interview